and welcome to Open House. I'm Margie O'Brien. This program aims to discuss some of the important topics in front of the General Assembly right now. And one could argue the most important topic, especially this week, Rhode Works. Joining me is House Speaker Nicholas Mattiello. Over 20 hours of public testimony on this one issue alone. Obviously, people care about this.
Yes, and that's a wonderful thing. I always said I'm glad people care about it. I want to acknowledge our Director Alvidi. Thank you for coming. It's an issue that a lot of people care about from a lot of different perspectives. I would say every Rhode Islander cares about it. We care about it in the General Assembly, and we start off with the proposition that we objectively have the worst roads and bridges and overpasses in the country, and that's inappropriate. So we're all looking for solutions, and I'm glad this panel got together. It's our way of informing the public, and we'll talk about the options and why I think Rhode Works right now, the improved version, is best for the state.
Great. I also want to welcome Majority Leader John DeSimone. Let's talk a little bit about the background. It's an awful headline to see, worse roads in America, but that is the case. What are we looking at?
It is the case, and I always knew, just intuitively, that our roads were not the best. But when I just learned that they were objectively the worst roads in the country and that they're going to become a safety concern, that alarmed me. That bothers me, because I think we have the best state in the country. We're a wonderful place, and we're trying to attract business, but you have to have a great education system, and you have to have great infrastructure if you want to attract new businesses and give the businesses the opportunity to grow here. So identifying that serious of a problem with our infrastructure means we have to find a serious and real solution, and a lot of folks spend a lot of time coming up with a solution, and that's what we're here to talk about, and that's what the General Assembly's working on, and we want to provide a solution that serves our citizens that is most appropriate. And I think we have that plan at this point, so I look forward to this discussion.
Well, I think most Rhode Islanders would say their ride might be terrible, but we are talking about a dangerous issue. We've seen photos, we've seen video. Can you sort of walk us through what you've noticed with sort of a trained eye? Some of the roads, some of the bridges, the infrastructure?
So what people see can be very easily recognized, but many times, as it is with many other things that we do, our own health and other things in life, it's the hidden dangers that are usually the most dangerous. And in the case of our roads and bridges, and in particularly our bridges, during my first couple of months here, or actually during the first few weeks, I had reports come into me where the decks of bridges actually blew through, in 4 instances, to the ground or roads below them. So that increased, of course, my level of concern, and we instituted an emergency bridge inspection during this summer to be able to take a good inventory of exactly what the condition of all of our bridges are. And the findings are that we have 250 in our states, 250 bridges that are rated as structurally deficient, and another 500 or so that are closely following them if we don't do something about it.
And not to be an alarmist, but does this mean that there could be a day where that one heavy truck might go over and it's the last straw that breaks the camel's back and there is an accident?
The other reason for that is to assure that we do whatever we need to do. So we have the information in hand now that we can proactively go out and fix, at least temporarily, any of those bridges that might create that kind of a problem. However, as construction in bridges and in that realm, there are many uncontrollable circumstances. And there's always a possibility of a bridge deck, as happened in the early months of my tenure here. This last year, for example, we were able to emergency repair 14 of the structurally deficient bridges temporarily, but another 14 became structurally deficient during that same period of time. So It's like trying to have a bucket and stem the tide that's coming in.
So Director, the way I've looked at the issue, and I've thought about this over the summer, and I've tried to consider every possible option.
Yes.
In light of the serious problem that we're facing, I come down to three possible courses of action. One, to do nothing, which I find absolutely unacceptable. Mm-hmm. The other one is to do the revised version of Rhode Works, which I believe is the best plan, and we'll talk about the terms thereof in a few minutes. Mm-hmm. Or the other is to do something completely different. And that doesn't mean rely on the current budget, because we know where that has led us, and we have structural deficits that are increasing every year, and so forth. And I want to say that people point to an 8-point-something or $9 billion budget and say you should have plenty of money there, but only about $3.5 billion of that is in fact discretionary, and you're talking municipal aid, school aid, general government. There's not a lot of discretionary spending in that, so we have to come up with a plan. So it's either do nothing, do the revised version of Rhode Works, or something else. And the only something else that I've ever come up with is a 10-cent increase in the gas tax, and I think that would be unfair to our taxpayers, wholly unacceptable by the citizens, and it would put our border communities at a great disadvantage when the price of gas ultimately goes back up. So we want Rhode Island to be competitive, and I've learned that every state on the eastern seaboard, except Georgia, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, in fact, toll trucks. The state of Georgia, interestingly enough, tolls cars, but not trucks. And Connecticut, next year, I'm told there's an agreement between the governor, the House Speaker, and the Senate President. They're going to toll cars and trucks. So Rhode Island's really going to be the one outlier that doesn't avail themselves of this solution. So in a strange way, we're putting ourselves at a competitive disadvantage with other states.
I think we always have been, Speaker, and I agree with your analysis. The first course of action, doing nothing, is unacceptable for the most obvious reason. It's just it becomes a safety hazard, and we'd be putting people's lives at risk. The third option, I think, pretty much exemplifies the course of action over the last 5 decades. So if history teaches us any lessons, is that the third option of trying to take out of the general fund or from other uses to put to a new use hasn't worked. That's what I think has gotten us to having the worst bridges in the country. So the middle option would be to find some alternate means of revenue. And it's being used all over the country. We're latecomers to this method of providing. In fact, Connecticut, you mentioned, had tolling at one time. They eliminated it for a few years, and now they're having to go back to it because they understand the value of having a dedicated and reliable funding stream for transportation is essential to the long-term planning. And I think we'll all end up with a better infrastructure and a more fair funding. You mentioned fairness. The gas tax is a funding mechanism that puts 100% of the burden on Rhode Islanders. And the tolling assesses the cost of rebuilding the infrastructure on the ones that are using it the most and putting the most damage on it. And in that case, it's the heavy trucks. And in that case, 60% of those trucks are coming from out of state. So from even a taxpayer standpoint, we're looking at two alternatives: the gas tax, where our taxpayers are funding 100% of that money, or tolling, where our taxpayers are only providing 40%.
Now, you said something. You said only heavy trucks.
Yes.
And I know there's a group out there that will say trucks today, cars tomorrow. And I don't know where they get that from. I left my crystal ball at home, so I don't have that ability. But these are heavy trucks. These are Class 8 heavy haul type trucks that carry very heavy loads, correct?
Yes.
And We've actually placed in the bill, that in order to expand that to passenger cars or light trucks, that they're in fact going to, a future General Assembly, because I've committed that as long as I'm Speaker, we're never expanding it to passenger cars or light trucks, but that if someone in the future, 20, 30 years, wants to expand tolling to cars, they'd have to get a vote of the people and let the people at that time make their proper determination. If it's ever brought up, which at this point I would tend to doubt. I don't foresee it in the near future, so I think that folks that are saying that are quite frankly wrong. I hope they're simply wrong and not disingenuous, but they're wrong. That's not the plan, correct?
Yeah. No. I just wanted to say, Leader, just when you put this bill in,
yes,
you've seen it get the support from the House Speaker, Senate President, and the Governor. You've heard from the people. It's not like you just created this out of thin air. There is a vetting process here. There's research. You've talked to experts. This is a solution that many people came up with.
Yes, and if I may just add to what the Speaker has already said and what the Director said. I mean, we went through this for almost a year, vetting the different plans. I think simply from a constituent point of view, I think it came down to two things. One, there's obviously a legitimate, immediate need to repair our bridges and our roads. I think that's undisputed. And then secondly is, how are we going to fund Rhode Works? And as the Speaker said, as the Director said, there's maybe a couple of different ways. But for me, it came down to simply what's going to get out-of-state money. And if we're anticipating around $50 million a year for the tolls, and 60% of that is $30 million over 10 years, that's $300 million of out-of-state money to help support our roads, which we all recognize those trucks are doing the most damage. So now the other 40%, I think where the Speaker came in terms of fairness, the other 40% is also coming from Rhode Island truckers, but we all agree that those trucks are doing the most damage to our roads and bridges. So the fairness comes in. Every other plan has our taxpayers subsidizing the damage that those trucks are causing. And that, in my mind, is profoundly unfair. So I think the revised road work bill that I introduced, that the Director testified on, that the Speaker supports, is the plan that is the most fair and gets its funding from those people, that industry that's doing the most damage to our roads. And for me, that is the most important thing that our constituents have to understand, and we have to get that word out there. We're never tolling cars. In fact, the legislation specifically says that we have to come back to the General Assembly, and it has to go to the voters if they're ever going to do cars in the future. So I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, but it's a question of immediate need and fairness. And I think this revised plan, I give the Director as much compliments as I can. This revised plan does the best for the state of Rhode Island and, most importantly, for our citizens.
So I was trying to explain this.
I think you're right. I think that there has been a lot of dialogue on this. We started out last May, June, and we had public hearings before the House and Senate. And there was testimony on all sides of this issue during that. During the summer, we reached out to citizens groups. The Speaker, I'm sure, and the Governor has spoken to many of the businesses here in the state. Everybody has had a chance to voice in on this. And here we are again during the last couple of days. We had a public session before the Senate that was, 5-6 hours of testimony? Sure. And yesterday
Longer
from 2 o'clock
House.
to nearly midnight, with the House having more public testimony. And during that time, besides Rhode Works, several other alternatives have been discussed and even introduced, I think, as bills. The key here, I think, as both the Speaker and the Leader said, is one of fairness, right? It's one where we know, and we've got several different studies that have been done by universities and scientists that put between 70% and 99%, depending upon the study, of the cause of the damage that's done to our bridges and roads on heavy vehicles.
And how heavy are these vehicles, and how heavy are the loads that these vehicles carry?
Well, they're tractor trailers. They're the kind that you see with articulated type vehicles that are carrying these long trailers behind them.
Now, what's the capacity of those trailers? I was told 40,000 pounds.
40,000, some of them go up to 80,000. As a matter of fact, you know, I just found this out in the last couple of days. The state of Rhode Island, and just about every other state in the country, has a permit process that companies can apply for oversized loads. And so what is that? When you break it down, what is that permit process? And this has been charged for years here in the state and charged for years in other states all over the country. Companies pay a fee so that their trucks can carry a heavier load because of the impact that those heavy loads have on our bridges. This has been in place in law in the state of Rhode Island and other places for years. Now, it's an overweight kind of fee that they're paying, but it's exactly the same concept that we're using and the same logic that we're using for the tolls. The tolls are a fee that heavy trucks would pay because they are the heavier users using the capacity of these bridges, okay, in relation to the cars. What's more, while they're producing 70% of the damage, when you look at all of the fees that people pay, people like you and I that just have a car or an SUV or a pickup truck are paying about 70% of the cost of repairing our roads and bridges. The other 30% is being paid by these heavy vehicles. So you have them causing 70% of the damage and only paying 30% of the cost of repair.
It seems unfair to the average Rhode Islander. Now let's talk a little about the mechanics of the bill. We reduced the gantries from about 17 to 14.
Yes.
And going from one end of Rhode Island through the other end of Rhode Island, north to south, the maximum toll on a heavy truck will be $20 each way once per day, correct?
That's correct.
And a typical toll is about $3. And that's
Typical
also
toll is
reduced.
about $3, yes.
And that's a reduction from the first Rhodes Work plan.
Yes.
Director, if I may ask, do you know how much it costs to cross the George Washington Bridge, just that one bridge?
Yeah. For a heavy truck, it costs $126.
Okay. And Rhode Island is buying goods that cross that bridge all of the time. So the argument that the cost of goods sold is going to increase because of a maximum, if it's a maximum $20, let's assume on average there'll be $10, $12, $3, $6, who knows. But do you envision that increasing the cost of goods sold? Because that argument just doesn't seem to make sense to me.
I don't buy that.
How much? What's a typical gallon of diesel fuel cost about? Is it $4 or $5 when at a normal market price? Yeah. So you're talking each individual gantry would be less than a gallon of diesel fuel under normal market conditions.
Oh, I mean, the cost comparisons, when you look at the cost breakdown of the cost of operating, for example, a transport truck of the kind we're going to be tolling, overwhelming, the biggest cost involved is the driver, the labor cost, and the fuel cost. At the very bottom of things, and for operators of those kinds of vehicles, is tolling. It's a very small fraction of their overall cost of operating those trucks.
And they pay a toll in every state on the Eastern Seaboard except Connecticut and Rhode Island and Georgia. So when they deliver goods to Rhode Island and they've come from anywhere in the South, they've accumulated tolls. And I don't believe when you factor in the cost of the truck, the driver, the diesel fuel, the insurance, the taxes, the property taxes, the licensing fees, I don't believe that the tolls even amount to anything more than a de minimis amount and add nothing to the cost of the truck.
That's correct.
But if you do buy that argument, and if you do buy the argument that it adds to the cost of goods sold, which I don't accept, that would mean that Rhode Island is, in buying goods, are subsidizing for the infrastructure of every state that truck comes through.
They have been for years.
And the citizens of those states aren't contributing to the Rhode Island infrastructure. It seems that that places us at a competitive disadvantage that's not fair to our citizens.
We're helping pay for every other state's improvements to their infrastructure, except for our own. We're footing the whole bill ourselves for our own.
So it's not really a surprise that our infrastructure is not as good as theirs and deficient, because we don't have the appropriate funding mechanisms that all the other states have learned that they have to rely upon.
That's correct.
Leader, one of the aspects of the new revised plan is that we were able to get more federal funding.
Yes.
Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, when we got the extra federal money, we were able to lower the cost of the tolls and decrease the amount of tolls, and that has helped us subsidize this new Rhode Works project. So I think that was very important. But just to add to what the prior conversation, the other thing about the trucks is that they get 5-6 miles a gallon, right, Director? That's all they get.
I believe so. Yeah.
So to say that they're going to divert from the tolls that are $3 when they're only averaging 5 or 6 miles a gallon is also sort of ridiculous, I would suggest.
I tend to agree with that, Leader, but when you ask the trucking industry, and some groups have suggested, we asked them, they said that they're going to divert, and I love some of your answers to that, Director. If you ask them, are you going to divert, of course you expect them to say yes, because, I think the tolling plan is the best plan, but it is a cost on trucks, and obviously they don't want the cost, no matter how fair it is, and I respect the fact that they don't want it, and we've listened to them, but we expect them to say they're going to divert. We also expect them not to divert, because it's too expensive to divert, both in terms of fuel, time, and total expense that breaks and so forth. I would imagine it takes a lot of energy to start up a 40, 80,000 pound truck from stop. A lot more gas than keeping it moving on the highway.
Well, think about the practicality, as you said, of it happening. So let's say along 95 we have 3, 4, 5 locations that from Connecticut to Attleboro on 95, a truck passing through Rhode Island, one of those 6 out of 10 trucks that are on that freeway that are going to pass through and go to up north. So let's say there are 4 locations along 95, 5, however many there are. That means a truck would have to get off the highway, avoid a $3 toll, get back on the highway, get back off the highway again into traffic and smaller roads to avoid another $3 toll and get back on, and then do that 4 or 5 times. They would increase their travel time considerably. Absolutely. Doing that. I mean, even in a car, you would, if in a small vehicle, you would increase your time. So in a large truck, even more so. Time is money to that industry. The time that it takes them and the fuel that it affords them to get from one point to another makes all the difference. And a $3 toll here or there is not going to make a difference in the bottom line.
How do you make the local truckers feel better about this? The companies that are based in Rhode Island that have 10, 15 trucks that are going out every day, they are looking at this as it's going to affect their bottom line.
Yes. So the alternative is without a new revenue stream, one that we think is a fair one. For all of those reasons that we talked about before, they're contributing more to the destruction of the roads. Right. They're paying improportionately less compared to the average taxpayer footing the bill up until now. It's a matter of fairness for them to step up to the plate and participate in the reconstruction of bridges, which, to a large extent, is going to benefit their bridges. If we have to eventually, because of poor funding, and the do-nothing kind of approach that was one of the ones that the Speaker mentioned as an alternative, in time, many of those bridges that are structurally deficient will have to be closed down. And if that happens, it's going to impact their bottom line much more than a tolling system would. They'll be immobilized, or it'll take incredibly longer times and more money for them to get to where they need to. The evidence of that was when we had to close down the Pawtucket River Bridge.
Right.
And,
I don't know, Speaker. I mean, there were millions of dollars involved.
Oh, absolutely. As a private attorney, I received calls from trucking companies that actually went through the tolls rather than divert around, just using 295, which is close by. So, you know, time is of the essence, and they would get the fine. They would call an attorney, try to reduce it somewhat, but they were still paying in excess of $1,000, $1,500 just to cross that bridge. But I do want to say, Marge, that most businesses, on average, are okay with it. No business wants increased cost. But if they get value for it, they respect the value of it. And we've got a lot of businesses in Rhode Island, and I've talked to a lot of them that said, you know, obviously we don't like increased costs, but the improved roads and bridges and infrastructure are more valuable to us. So there's a lot of businesses out there that are actually in favor of it. And the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce just a few days ago, which is a business coalition, actually came out and endorsed this plan because they know the value of infrastructure. So, you know, what I've been saying is we're a great state. We're a small state. But because we're small, that loud minority voice of no, and it's a very small minority, and I said it's not the minority party, it's the loud minority voice of no, tries to stop all kinds of development, whatever it is. You know, I think we have to be skeptical. And I'm the guy who put up the brakes on this last year. I talked to everyone, I studied it, and I determined that we could make it better with new federal dollars and so forth, and we made the plan a lot better and more cost-effective for our citizens. There's 65% less interest in this plan. The repayment period is 15 years versus 30 years. But we have to move forward. We can't be a community of no. We have deficient infrastructure, and that's unacceptable. You know, when I retire from the speakership, if I have to look back and know that I left this burden, I kicked the can down the road for another generation, I just would probably not be able to live with myself, because I believe if you're going to take on the job, you have to move forward in a proactive, productive way, and you have to serve your constituents, whether it's easy or hard. And, you know, that this is a somewhat politically charged issue, but it's our responsibility to take a leadership position and to lead and to inform folks, which is what we're trying to do today, and inform them of what the need is, how great the need is, and your possible options. And after studying it for a long time, asking for an economic impact study, talking to economists, looking at all the factors, I've determined that there's not a better option. And, you know, I just can't agree, in light of a structural deficit, just take it out of the budget. You know, and that's unfair to the constituents, because if you say the money's there, obviously that's the easiest thing to believe. But even if you believe that, you have to recognize 100% of the cost is going to be paid by Rhode Islanders under that circumstance. And eventually fees and taxes and so forth are going to have to go up if it's being borne entirely by Rhode Islanders. This spreads 60% of the cost to out-of-state trucking companies that are actually using our roads, benefiting from our roads, imposing wear and tear and destruction upon our roads, and it just seems fair. This is a good plan for our constituents. So in this case, we're going to respect the opposing viewpoint. We've made the bill better, but we're going to tell the loud minority voice of no in Rhode Island that we're going to move forward in a productive way for our citizens, and we're going to serve our citizens. And ultimately, I'm convinced that this is going to be an economic development initiative, and that it's going to move the state forward, it's going to create jobs, and it's going to give Rhode Islanders, I'm 52 years of age, this is going to give Rhode Islanders, for the first time since I've been born, a pride in their infrastructure. And we're going to be above average in our infrastructure and not have to pay for blown out tires and broken axles all the time.
I'm going to leave you there. Let's end on a high note where Rhode Islanders will have something to be very proud about. Thank you all for joining me for this episode of Open House, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Open House. I'm Margie O'Brien.